All right, welcome back, all. Okay, this is going to be the second half of Lecture 8, focused on what was her name? Barry Ann, I think. Yes, Barry Ann article. And we're going to jump in slide number 8, Women's Obstacles in the Middle East. Talk about a couple, and then I'll really hit like a big list at the end. All right, so just from a formal institution's perspective, representation in the Middle East tends to be really low. Um, at one point, I mean, it's better now. There are a lot of quota systems in place, which we'll talk about shortly. Um, but it's still only around 18% on average. Some states are really bad, like Egypt and Algeria, etc. And so it's not great, especially when we're talking about sort of lower house representation or leadership, etc. Okay, the next slide. How do we conceptualize representation in political science? I think it's important to sort of think about how this might work because the core of the argument in the paper we read from Barry Ann is basically suggesting that, the assumption is that women don't really have any power in the Middle East. And, from a couple different perspectives, that's probably true, right? But they're more powerful than people give them credit for, right? And there's more hope than a lot of people just sort of assume. And so, like, I think that's a pretty good core argument. Um, the problem in political science and economics sometimes is that it misses the human element, right? We're always worried about like how do we operationalize and sort of turn something into a data observation. But like power in the family or around the kitchen table or in the bazaar, like those are hard to measure, right? Um, they're hard to measure, but it, it's hard to say they don't exist. Okay, so how do we conceptualize power in general? The most, I would say, cited and used operationalization of power is what is the the percentage in the lower house of Congress, legislative body, whatever you want to call it, right? Um, and so we use this for things like ethnic groups, we use it for religious groups, women versus men, all these sorts of things. And so the focus is on the lower house in general, right? Because some states only have one, but a lot of states don't really have a powerful upper house like the United States does. They're sort of political power in name only, right? So if you think about like the House of Lords in the UK or in England, they don't really have a lot of power, right? And there's a few reasons for that. They've been sort of stripped over time because of the movement away from primogeniture and noble blood and all of these sorts of things. But also they tend to be but they also tend to be sort of disconnected from the average citizen's real life. And so in general, the idea that your lower house is a little bit more connected to real society, right? And so there are a few reasons why that's the way of it. But there are questions about this, right? Even if we're talking about gender representation, are we talking about just natural open elections, or are we talking about sort of gender quotas, right? Because there are differences between the two and the quote unquote power that women have. Um, oh, yeah. It didn't make sense when I read MidEast struggles with natural, but it was supposed to just be indented. Yeah, the Middle East struggles with natural representation, as does much of the world, to be perfectly honest. Even Europe, who leads the charge, has quotas in place for the most part, right? As women's representation exists, though, excuse me. Oh yeah, most regions do develop historically. Yeah, I mean societies tend to be patriarchal, right? And so what we're learning from research on quotas is that they can be messy at first, right? And we'll talk about some of that stuff. Um, I have trouble sort of just saying like any idea is a great idea, other than I don't know, maybe freedom. Uh, but and even that is touchy, right? Freedom to murder. Anyway, and so gender quotas can be messy at first, right? We learned this from the business world, where especially Scandinavian states sort of forced corporate boards to put women on the board, right? And there were difficulties at first. The same with political quotas. There are difficulties at first, and we'll talk about some of those. But it does create space generally, and it also creates experiences, expertise, networking, etc., that will eventually build women's power in a society. Is what we're tending to find. It takes time, right, to build names. Name recognition is huge when we're talking about elections. To change minds, right, especially to sort of liberalize ideas about women's roles in societies and things like this, and to generate experience and networking and understanding of like institutional rules and all of these sorts of things. Also, to be able to move up into like party leadership and stuff, right? Nobody's going to make you a party leader your first year, despite the fact that like you haven't been allowed to be there before. So these are some difficulties. Let's see. Post 9/11 was a really big experience in the Middle East for a number of reasons. We went from maybe 3 to 4% on average female representation in the region to about 18 to 20% on average. Some states they have 30% or more. Some states have far less. There's variation in the region, but the average has certainly kicked up quite a bit. Okay, let's see. What is another way of sort of conceptualizing representation? This would be leadership, right? Has has a leader from your state been a woman, right? Either a president or a prime minister, or even if you're dictatorship, which I guess I'm struggling to think of a female leader in a dictatorship. I'm sure there's one out there. Um, you know, just a dichotomous variable. Have you ever had a leader or not? Do you have a female leader? That sort of thing. And so it looks like about maybe one third, almost exactly a third, 30 to 35% of states in the modern era have had a female leader, prime minister, president, whatever you might want to call it. The Middle East has, for the most part, not. But again, neither has the United States. So don't point the finger too much. Okay, cabinet positions is another way to conceptualize power, right? The United States cabinet positions are incredibly powerful positions. They have to be sort of approved by the Senate, right? The historical precedent is to just mostly allow a president to appoint their cabinet. Even though you need congressional approval, there's very rarely a lot of pushback. This is changing a bit. But in general, in the Middle East, you really don't see these powerful positions being given out to women. And then finally, party leadership. Party leadership can be very powerful. Nancy Pelosi, as the Speaker of the House, was a remarkably powerful woman and a remarkably powerful Speaker of the House, even. She really had her shit in line, right? But it takes time. Um, if again, if women had not had any experience in your party period, then it takes a long time to sort of develop. I don't know. Even the legitimacy from your peers and colleagues to say, okay, you've been here, you for 10, 20 years, whatever it might be, I don't know, and you can lead the party, right? Okay, next slide. Increasing representation post 9/11. Like I said, the area tended to see quite a boost in representation. A lot of them put through gender quotas during the post 9/11 period. Part of that had to do with the U.S. presence in the region, right? We were involved in the Iraq War, Afghanistan. We were getting more and more involved in the region for things like energy, etc. Um, we also sort of purportedly, I would say, were pushing democracy and human rights as goals of the Iran and Iraq war. I don't know. I have trouble with that. It doesn't turn out well. I mean, look at Afghanistan. Um, but countries sort of wanted to be on their best behavior because the U.S. was in the region. Tensions were very high, and nobody wanted to be. A lot of these states did not want to be seen as sort of backing Islamist jihadism and human rights abuses and terrorism, etc. Right? Okay. We also saw, like I mentioned, rising gender quotas. So list balancing. Another part of it is bigger district magnitudes, right? In America, we have what's called first past the post, majoritarianism, pluralism, whatever you might want to call it, right? Where we only have two parties basically competing for an election, but not all are like that. In some places, like say Israel, I think they have around 160 members of their Knesset, which is their lower house, but there's also 160 people running in one single district, right? And way more than 160 actually. And so, your electoral magnitude, how many people get elected from your geographical territory, whether it be a state or a county or whatever you might want to call it, sort of can limit or give space to alternative candidates. All right, what are the criticisms of gender quotas? Because we're going to talk about gender quotas extensively toward the end of the chapter, the lecture. There are some criticisms, and probably deserved in some senses, right? Like forced equality is forcing voters to choose a woman over anyone. Is that democratic and fair and equality, etc. Right? There are all of these sort of affirmative action arguments. I'm sure you all know a lot of them, right? Another problem is sort of ties to existing elites. Like what we see in the region, especially, is the wives of legislators or the president or whatever it might be, or powerful business interests, or sort of their family members or like sisters on this nepotism stuff, right? And so how different is it when you just have that rather than an actual opening up for women in general, and new ideas and all of these sorts of things? Uh, Gender quotas can also still leave tyranny in the majority, right? Very, very few states actually say that you have to have 50% women. And I think Rwanda is one of the few, I think there's like 4 or 5 in the whole world right now that have like half representation. Um, and so this still sort of leaves tyranny the majority. Women aren't necessarily creating whole new parties or platforms. Um, and if you only have 20% representation, I don't know that it's hard to argue that like that's going to bring a major change when you already have these sort of coalitions built. Let's see. There are also questions about the long-term effectiveness, right? And so I touched on a little bit about like the snowballing effect and how women can sort of build power and network and experience, and this can sort of snowball and bring even greater representation over time. It didn't necessarily happen in Egypt, where they did have a quota system, and then the quota system was scrapped shortly thereafter, and women's representation just plummeted again, right? But I would also say that was a pretty short term experiment, And it's hard to say that like only a few years is actually going to build, what I'm talking about, this snowballing effect. All right, that's enough of that. Let's see. We're going to move to slide 11. Gender quotas, a deeper look. Okay. A lot of times what this means is like you're either guaranteeing a certain number of seats in your chamber or a percentage of legislative seats, right? And I got a couple examples here. One is party lists. In some states, the elections work, instead of getting to vote for a candidate, you vote for a party, right? And the party leader will set up a list. And the state will say basically, okay, every other name has to be a woman, or there has to be a woman among the top four, or something of that sort, if that makes sense. There's also blind lists where the party doesn't even show you who might be filling the seat. You just blindly vote for a political platform, and then after the vote sort of plays out and the state allocates you the percentage of seats that you get in the chamber, then the leader will build a list and it has to include a percentage of women, right? And so there are a lot of different ways to approach this, but I just want to sort of provide a couple examples. All right. Furthermore, this is maybe the most popular program in the world, the most diffused policy on Earth in the sort of late 20th century. 80% or so of all countries include some semblance of a political gender quota system. It started really in Europe and just spread everywhere rather quickly. Um, we have a lot of data from corporate boardrooms. So some of the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, have put in corporate quota systems, and basically, like they'll say, okay, you got to include 20% of your corporate directors has to be a woman, and then we're going to like move it up to 40 or 50% over time, right? And so at first, this was pretty messy, and there were some issues, right? Again, just like politics, the nepotism stuff was still an issue. So if you just invite your wife to the corporate boardroom, like is that actually giving new voice to the corporate board? Um, these sorts of things, right? And so the nepotism problem still was a problem, and still in many senses is a problem, but it is improving. There have been a whole bunch of different dependent variables, right? What outcomes are happening because of this. And it's a mixed bag still, right? This is kind of a new phenomenon, maybe 30 to 40 years old, and for most nations, much, much younger than that, even. It was messy at first, like I said. We have seen, okay, when we're talking about how does this affect diversity in your company, mixed to positive results. How does it affect the board quality and the expertise of your board? Generally thought to be positive. How do stockholders respond to these changes? Almost invariably negative. Uh, what does profitability and sort of performance look like in the long term? Mixed to positive. Again, tends to be pretty rough at first, but once the kinks are worked out, it looks like this is actually a pretty great corporate move. Finally, a lot of the meta-analysis actually shows that the the researchers and this realm of sort of political business, social science, management, all of this sort of stuff tends to disproportionately lean toward negative citations, um, and maybe that's influencing ideas on how this all plays out. Okay, next slide, number 12, gender quotas and governance. How, if we're talking about governance and not corporate boards, we're kind of going to make a shift here. What do we know about gender quotas and governance-dependent variables or outcomes, right? First, how do gender quotas in legislatures tend to affect policy and ideology? We tend to see either no effect or a little bit of shift towards sort of butter, right, rather than the guns. Domestic social policy, spending for like education, women, children, these sorts of things. But a lot of mixed results too. It's going to take time, and it depends on what culture we're talking about, what context, all these things. All right, voting. How does inclusion of women in legislatures, etc., impact voting outcomes? Um, Tends to be mixed again, both at the aggregate level for voting totals and voting percentages, etc., but also on just women voters. And it doesn't, we're not really sure if there even is an effect on whether it bolsters the likelihood of a woman voting. The snowball effect, which I think is maybe the most powerful effect we're finding here, is that representation begets further representation, right? It starts to avalanche. Okay, moving to science. I think that science, in many senses, has really led the charge here because science was very, very male driven and in many ways sort of stereotypical and dismissive of women for a long, long time, right? And we're finally getting to where like women are kind of kicking butt in science these days, right? They've developed this snowball effect and they're publishing at huge numbers. They're making groundbreaking research. They're filling up sort of institutional faculties and more. So I think science is a really excellent way, um, at least from my perspective. Again, girl dad, little biased, but I think science has some cool stuff to show about how we can make a transition. And we've gotten cool new ideas, just like the 3.5% idea. And the woman to the right, who is Hannah Arendt, if anyone's ever taken my political philosophy class, survived the Nazi regime, escaped, and spent her life sort of trying to understand and discuss and I don't know, disseminate information about dictatorships and totalitarianism and Nazi approaches to thought control and more. So, fascinating woman, and there's thousands of them out there, from Marie Curie to I don't know, who do I love? Bob's wife, Irene Perry. I think she's an amazing woman scientist. So yeah, all right. Um, I would also say, like, man, come on, all humans are capable of good, of excelling, of knowledge, of research, of science, of governance, of everything, right? Um, the issue is we need good nuance, we need good context, we need to construct good rules about including women and things of this sort, supporting women. Um, and we need to really take our time. So we've talked about this a bunch of times in this class about how hopeful political science can be sometimes, right? And they were very hopeful about like the end of history, right? And things of this sort. But sometimes science can be pretty disdainful, right? And at first, when we didn't know much about this and we didn't know how to implement it, it was messy, right? And there were problems. Uh, but over time, we've learned that like this is generally a good thing. We get good outcomes from it. The problem is that like researchers who put out a lot of information on the problems at first, while it is good research and there's a lot of good stuff out there, it can be used by hateful influencers and misogynists and others to say, look, women suck and they can't be on corporate boards and they mess things up and like that's not fair. And so you got to be thoughtful about how you approach these things and really be skeptical, take the long term perspective, understand that new institutions and rules are almost always messy. Yeah. All right. Next slide. Issues for women in the Middle East, right? And the first thing I start with here is a little bit of a disclaimer. There's a lot of variation in this region. And some states like Israel, Jordan, Tunisia, Turkey have some semblance of democracies, arguably functioning democracies, arguably rights for women, right? There are better and worse. But I would still say even this like better list has some real troubles. Under Erdogan, under Netanyahu, there are troubles with their democracies, and so keep that in mind. Okay, what are some of the issues in the area? First, social perspectives and just quote unquote the role of women, right? And this runs deep. And this is not just a Middle East thing. There are these thoughts in Europe. There's deep machismo in South America. There are these thoughts in Asia, right? Like this is not sort of just a Middle East rooted problem, right? But it does run pretty deep from all the way from the Ottoman empires through Islam, etc., to today. And so there's a couple of things, right? Like their system, even under the Ottomans, was highly patriarchal. Um, they used the sort of the bloodline, right? This is called primogeniture. Firstborn son gets all the shit. The rest of them, sorry for you, right? And so that whole thing, like if you're a daughter, we're not even gonna think about you for the most part, right? The primogeniture stuff runs deep globally in general. Europe did the same thing. You could see some other like sort of disturbing views or treatment of women through sort of harems and slavery and other things in the area. And we tend to have in the area also just a dearth of women's autonomy, right? And this includes things like some states you have to have a familial male escort to be out in public, right? So, Afghanistan is not in the region, quote unquote, but some states sort of take this approach. We also have ideas about education, right? Like how long should women be educated, and should they be in college, and all of these sorts of things. Should we differentiate male content from female content? Should men be educated about different things than women? These thoughts also sort of run deep. And then in some places you have separation of genders, not only in the mosque, but also in government facilities, markets, etc., which can be, it can send signals, and it can also undermine women's ability to be able to sort of network or all of these sorts of things. All right, next slide, number 14. Further issues for women in the Middle East. So, geography is also a problem. Um, a lot of research points to the idea that the lower the population density, the more powerful the sort of patriarchal thoughts, the violence against women, the repression in the family, all of these sorts of things. So, yes, while you might see like more instances of domestic violence, stuff like that in urbanized regions, if we're talking about how often does it happen, like per family, it's far higher in rural areas, right? And there's a couple of reasons. First, it's out of sight, out of mind. If you live 2 miles from your nearest neighbor because you're a farming community or something like that, uh, it stays on the land. Um, there's little enforcement, right? Some of these states, and especially we've talked about really early on, have difficulty enforcing their law in the hinterland, right? In rural or really far away places from urban centers. And so that can also lead to more domestic violence, repression, etc. And I actually think like a lot of the authors and a lot of the researchers say it's underreported, right? You're far more likely to see reports from like neighbors or even women themselves in urban areas where like, everybody can hear it or see it or whatever it might be, or where women might be able to like sneak off and talk to a friend or a neighbor for a moment where they can't do that on a rural property. And so, like, it may be an even bigger problem than we understand. Okay, institutional rules are also a hindrance for women in the Middle East, right? A lot of these nations have, I don't know, they purport to have rights, and they'll have like rights on paper, right? But the other legal boundaries exist, right? And so, like, if you can't even leave your house to go to a voting booth without a cousin or an uncle or your father or brother or whatever, uh, then maybe you just don't get to vote, right? The parties control the lists. A lot of these nations use party lists or proportional representation or coalitional government, etc. And women aren't in control of the parties, right? And so, like, if you don't toe the party line or do what they tell you to, then maybe you're just not off on the top of the list, right? You just didn't make the cut, right? And then finally, nepotism versus real representation. This is a problem across the literature, across the nations, across democracy, autocracy, all of these sorts of things, um, just including powerful elites, wives and sisters, and etc. Maybe isn't the point, right? So that can cause problems as well. And sometimes we have found that like presidents' wives will whitewash all of these human rights abuses against women, um, so that they can keep powerful positions or keep their husbands in powerful positions and things of this sort, which can be pretty troubling. All right, finally, it's not as much a problem in the Middle East as maybe North Africa or Eastern Africa, like Sudan and Democratic Republic of Congo and others, but they're pretty close to that region. Um, India as well, and Afghanistan, and it also does happen in places like Syria, Yemen, etc. Sexual violence as political violence, and sexual violence as political intimidation, right? Which is a very troubling trend. And this not only happens to sort of women speaking out in social movements, but it can also happen in civil and ethnic war and take a really sort of disgusting purification hint to it, right? I'm going to commit sexual violence against you because you're subhuman and maybe it will, like, I don't know, make you better, or you'll have to have a child of my ethnic race or whatever. Like, there's some really gross stuff out there, right? And then finally, honor killings. And honor killings, they still happen in the Middle East. They definitely still happen in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, right, where a woman will either be, I don't know, commit infidelity or even just be raped, and their family, or especially the male members of their family or their community, will stone them to death or throw acid on their face to forever mark them. Um, there's some nasty stuff out there, right? And so, like, this sexual violence as intimidation is still a problem in some areas in the world. Okay, finally, last slide. How do we build women's power in the region? Domestically, we need sort of snowballing, right? And I do think, like, while there are problems with quotas, and especially early on, there are questions about, like, is this even sort of equality, right? Eventually, it will grow, and you will see powerful women actors who have built strong experience, who have built strong networking, who understand the institutional rules. And so this has generally been the way of Europe. In some senses, it has been the way of South America, um, though there are still machismo problems there. But domestically, it can be important. International pressure can be important, right? Yes, even if the US's intentions were less than pure, or the West's intentions are less than pure sometimes, and even if their sort of, I don't know, pressures for human rights and democracy are less important than their economic or military strategic concerns, they still are pressure, right? And so I think international pressure is still important to freeing up some space for women. Uh, Domestic and bazaar, right? So the family and the market and the bazaars and the black market economy, women hold a lot of power in that realm, and also sort of inside the family, right? Social media has given a lot of space for women. It was very powerful in the Arab Spring movement. Unfortunately, a lot of these states have sort of shut down, limited, monitor, etc., the social media sphere. And in many ways, like the tech companies are cool with that, and that is a little troubling, because they could also have a whole bunch of power in influencing free speech in the region, but I don't know that they want to. And then finally, suffragette organizations and the development of NGOs, even if women are not allowed the space legally or de facto, right, de jure or de facto. Suffragette movements can be important, and I talked about Eleanor Roosevelt to begin with, and there are plenty of examples out there, of sort of building this stuff and then creating space and then becoming a powerful leader even after you've been given the right to vote or participate, etc. However, be careful about this sort of stuff, right? Because this can go the wrong way. And the US and the West rarely get the electoral outcomes that they want in not only the Middle East, but in South America with all the leftist movements from like the 70s, 60s through the 80s, right? And plenty of other places. And so democracy can cause problems, right? Hitler was elected through a democracy. Yes, he later declared martial law, and there was the sort of fire at the Bundestag and all the rest. But like democracy doesn't necessarily mean purity or these sorts of things, right? Women supported Hitler and apartheid and all the rest too. And so, like, I don't know, sometimes what will happen is a state will, or leaders of a state will open up under pressure to a little bit of democratization, knowing that they have a lock on the women vote, and so it's just going to perpetuate their further power, right? And so just be careful. All right. This is a long one, but like I love this stuff. I think it's very important. Thanks for being here. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.